Think of the movies that really defined your childhood for you. Now think of the one name that has been attached to nearly all of them, including a couple of tiny low-budget productions like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, no big deal. Give it up for the president of Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy.
You know, it's as I said, I think quality is always everything.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing to be involved with something like Star Wars, where almost every single person that's making a contribution in whatever it is we're creating, they're doing their best work. There is this persistent story of Star Wars. That's what we're building on. So rather than thinking of it that we're just going to go off and do a one-off story, we're constantly thinking about, okay, what does this really mean inside the long saga and mythology that George Lucas created. I have such an amazing team at Lucasfilm. Every single person that is in charge of all these different areas. The great thing is, number one, they're a fan. And secondly, they strive for excellence. So it could go on forever. It could go on forever. It could go on forever. Forever.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a critique of Episode 2 of the Disney Plus series Kenobi. Before we begin the critique, I feel that I should mention a topic that had only been briefly explored in the critique for Episode 1. In Episode 1, I had commented on how the Force had been absolutely annihilated to the point that what had once been a mysterious and wonderful tool in which not only any Force user could wield, but for any writer of this media to be able to implement in what elements would be used as the framework for their story. I could only continue to stress the innumerable issues in how the Inquisitors had wielded the Force to both figuratively and literally hold each other back, instead of opting and doing the rational thing and directing it towards their enemies. As the whole summation of their entire organization within the Empire was to hunt down and exterminate the Jedi, that their complete ineptitude in how they would choose to employ the Force to incapacitate or even to locate their enemies was quite a confusing and downright irritating venture into how far this show has gone in continuing to destroy what little semblance of world building remained. Obi-Wan's overall goal was in direct correlation in wanting to protect Luke from the Empire in order to secure his safety, to the point that Luke would have been ready to begin his Jedi training in order to bring down the Empire and the Sith. Having it be that Obi-Wan had chosen to leave the planet when not even just one day ago that those very same Inquisitors were on that very same planet looking for a Jedi has only shattered the fundamental core for the setup for the very story that they had centered this character around. The reason that I reiterate this point yet again is because of the error that I had already brought forth in Episode 1, which was how the Inquisitors had the ability to harness the Force in order to locate their enemies but instead chose not to. More specifically to the point of how in having Obi-Wan choose to leave the planet that would then run the risk of leaving Luke exposed. If there was no one left capable enough in protecting Luke and his family, that there would have been nothing in preventing the Inquisitors in using the Force to locate the one Force-sensitive child on that planet that was meant to be protected by Obi-Wan that entire time. That Luke would have been located and captured, Vader would have discovered Luke's origins and would have carried the possibility in turning him to the dark side. Obi-Wan never would have trained Luke. The rebellion would have lost, and the original trilogy, and by extension, Disney's sequel trilogy and TV shows would have never taken place. The only reason in which none of this occurred was in that the writers purposely wrote their villains to be so incompetent by such a significant margin in showcasing their ability and being able to utilize one of the greatest tools available to them, but instead electing them and deciding not to. Now that that issue had been addressed, I would not want to waste any more of your time more than the show already has for mine, so let's just jump right into the critique. Right at the beginning, we are given yet another montage.
What?
We have not even gone past this 10-second mark, and yet the number of complications that has arose cannot simply be ignored. In my critique for Episode 1, I had addressed the inefficiency in the decision-making for the writers to have started the episode with a montage detailing the entirety of the prequel trilogy without bothering to address any of the actual points established between the relationship forged through Obi-Wan and Anakin's interactions. Not only was the montage so artificially presented without any measure of consideration, but that the showrunners could believe that any of the effectiveness of what comprised the entirety of the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker, the birth of Darth Vader, the destruction of the Jedi, the rise of the Empire, and the exile of the few remaining Jedi could have possibly been summarized in a 4-minute montage is baffling. One might have hoped that any semblance of logic would have entered the mind of the producers at that point, but that would be instilling even an iota of confidence towards the same individuals that have been enforcing their agenda for almost a decade.
They've made the film again, but not only that they've made it with a truly brilliant creative team, but they have a character in it that I feel is truly progressive.
How Rey beat Kylo Ren.
Why is that so hard for people to get? Like, she's super strong and he's like so weak.
JJ talking quite openly about how he wanted to honour the authenticity of the films, but to bring that up to date with what I think they've done in terms of being more diverse about the casting. I found that very exciting.
I'm so excited that, guys, the girls in this movie kick some butt. Every single one is so good, and I can't wait for everyone.
About having Star Wars' first on-screen female villain.
Do you think she has any just kind of inherent weaknesses or...
I mean, I don't really believe in weaknesses in people.
Okay. I like that outlook.
Yeah.
It's very positive.
Because I think you can't sort of decide, like, what's good and what's bad in a person.
How would you describe her in one word?
In one word?
One word.
I'm going to go for the generic.
Okay.
Badass. And that's what really excites me about this film, is that there has been so much, there's been diversity in the casting.
How Rey understands BB-8.
She's vastly intelligent.
So my character, you know, she's a powerful leader. She's a powerful leader. Yes. In a very woman-centered world, which I was very excited to kind of be in that, because I feel like Star Wars is very like patriarchal, so it was kind of cool to have like this sort of woman-centered figure.
The look of my character, I was moved by the fact that he really wanted her strength to first lead with a very deep femininity. And to see a powerful female character also be feminine.
Leslie, you described The Acolyte as Kill Bill meets Frozen, which I'm personally obsessed with.
Okay, good. I'm glad you like that.
Yes.
You have a female character like that, and it's also honouring its roots.
You know, I don't think that I really understood the largeness of it. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, you can't really take the time to think about it, otherwise it becomes like really overwhelming. And I'm glad that I didn't like fully process it.
We relate to Captain Phasma not through that random group of elements that causes us to look a certain way in flesh. We relate to her due to her actions and her character.
That not even a fragment of logic could have been applied to address some of, if any, of the most glaring inconsistencies that the first episode had already displayed in such a haphazard manner that they would end their opening montage of the second episode with one of the most brain-dead decisions for the lead character to make before embarking on a journey that should have never arose, other than this company milking what little bit of this story is left. That Obi-Wan would go on the mission being so atypical for how calculated this individual has been shown to be in the 3 prequel films when making such crucial decisions, that he would then devolve to such a point that he would ever consider to display its lightsaber in such a public space on the very same planet in which several Inquisitors had arrived at multiple times, without ever stopping and realizing the seriousness of just how careless he was choosing to be at that specific moment. But why should any of that matter to the writers other than their desperation for needing their visuals for their trailers and showcasing a disheveled Obi-Wan returning to action just so that they could earn an extra $8 per household? That Obi-Wan was able to get on this transport without anyone even noticing his lightsaber being questionable enough, but that this montage in the opening for the second episode had reminded us on how Obi-Wan had paid for a transport to his destination, raising another issue with regards to the mechanics and the regulation of planetary travel being disregarded. In episode 5 of the Book of Boba Fett, upon the Mandalorian having secured a transport to Tatooine, the droid attendant had informed Mando that he would be unable to board a commercial flight at that point due to the number of weapons upon his person. Rather than looking for any other options for transportation, he immediately complied. For an individual so intent on not parting with his weaponry to the point that he had informed the droid that the weapons he carried were a part of his Mandalorian culture, specifically his religion, that he would so easily give up and surrender those very same weapons not even 5 seconds later. It is not only a contradiction on what little of his character there was, but that this would only simply continue to highlight how little establishment there is for the world building anymore in this universe. Why not have him search for other transportation? Would he have any contacts whom he request aid him for any debts owed? Would he be able to stow away without being noticed, so desperate and stubborn to part with his weapons per his own creed? Not only would this allow for its audience to understand this character, but in that it would expand the understanding of the history and culture of the Mandalorians. That he could so easily give up his weapons is such a quick moment which would cause one to think about the contradiction upon closer inspection. The droid had even made it a point to address Mando in offering the chance and waiting for a new flight the next day so that he may contact the supervisor to address the issue. How interesting could it have been to see the interaction between a Mandalorian being so hard-set on maintaining a hold on his weapons due to his beliefs that we would be allowed to see the confrontation that would arise in the supervisor attempting to persuade this individual to relinquish his weapons for the sake of the safety of the other passengers, or even the possibility that the Mandalorian would indeed be able to carry his weapons onto the next flight but under the monitor of a security force as a form of contingency. Once again, not that those specific scenarios should have happened, but in that any number of possible storylines that could have allowed for the growth upon the characteristics and history of its characters and how they would operate in the worlds that they traverse. Then again, the majority of these shows rely on its audience to simply sit back and watch the spectacle rather than focusing on the fundamentals and establishing the mechanics of how this universe would function. Should any individual on this flight be required to release their weapons to the custody of the flight attendants raise any possibility in understanding the establishment and enforcement of the rules of planetary travel, but that it would immediately be forgotten in this moment here simply so that Obi-Wan would be able to carry his weapons to his destination. Does it make sense that Obi-Wan could so casually walk through a crowd with not even one individual recognizing one of the highest-ranking Jedi Masters during the Clone Wars? Does it make sense that not one person noticed Obi-Wan's lightsaber as he traveled through such a public space? Does it make sense that the worker accepting travelers would not have seen Obi-Wan's lightsaber when standing only 3 feet away from him? Does it make sense that if she had seen the lightsaber that she would have simply ignored it despite her planet constantly being harassed by the Inquisitors in their mission in locating the Jedi? Does it make sense in not showing any droids or security searching the passengers before they're boarding the transport for weapons? Writing stories for multi-billion-dollar companies has only become so much easier when there are absolutely no requirements in caring about the actual media that comprises the majority of your fan base, despite how destitute this media has become.
I would like to go back to the beginning. Deborah, tell us about the genesis of the project and how we came to get to come back to this wonderful character.
Well, I was fortunate that, it was already in progress when I came onto it, and so, I inherited the project, obviously. And I think for me it was, it's very hard not to love a project that has 2 of the most iconic characters in cinematic history. And it was just exciting to get to do something that was very character-based and to get to work with you and Hayden and all this cast.
I have to confess, I didn't know much about Star Wars.
No, it's good. It's a good. No, we're a welcoming space.
The Mandalorian completely sucked me in. And having seen Deborah's amazing work on it, and just talking to her, Deborah cares so much about character work and relationship. And that's personally what I'm interested in. And I think that's why Obi's so strong, is because of the character work that we all got to do.
It's obviously a pretty intense role to try to cast, especially with children. So I think, not only was it Princess Leia, but it's also you've got Carrie Fisher, so you've at least 2 hugely iconic characters, and you're trying to find the younger version. So the biggest thing we were really looking for was, someone who had the spirit, that wasn't going to try to copy or mimic Carrie, but was actually just going to kind of embody it. So I think really when it became clear is Ewan and I actually sat with Vivian in my office, and she has this crazy photographic memory so we didn't give her any sides. We gave it to her. She literally had it memorized within about 2 minutes. But just seeing these 2 work together was really what it was. Yeah, in that moment. But for me, it was actually one of the things that I found really attractive about the project. And it's very hard to justify why he would leave. And so really, like what you're saying is we needed an incredibly strong reason. And I think the other thing that we really, Vivian and I both really liked about the project was we liked getting to sort of shine a light on Princess Leia and, acknowledge that, she was half of it as well.
Upon Obi-Wan's arrival to the planet, we are then given several establishing shots of the city and the juxtaposition of the buildings with how they intersect in creating an atmosphere as grim as the surrounding area. For its many faults in the writing, world building, assassinations of character, disregard for the lore, questionable acting, forced agendas, disestablishment of previously established setups, and forcing any arc for those individuals that never earned them, one of the few facets in some of the media previously shown, excluding the Book of Boba Fett, lies in the production value. a haunting melody of clouds overlaid with the heavy atmosphere of a world reminiscent of the underlevels of Coruscant in the prequels, while simultaneously establishing the network of buildings and how one might view this planet as being difficult to navigate with its maze-like appearance spread throughout the city. Unfortunately, there is only so much that the visuals can carry for the show before the shortcomings of the script are to make their presence known once more. At this point, Obi-Wan notices a city employee with whom he requests help in locating a signal so that he may pinpoint Leia's location from the signature of the ship carrying Leia being tracked. Not even a minute can go by without this show continuing to throw itself down the garbage chute. In episode 1 of Kenobi, Bail Organa had informed Obi-Wan that upon Leia's kidnapping, that the kidnappers had left no ransom, that they had no leads, and that they had deduced that the ship that was carrying Leia was on the path to Daiyoo. Much like I had previously stated before, if Bail was to be aware of the fact that his daughter was currently on the path to that specific planet, would he not think to contact the very same empire that he is a member of in order to notify them of the location of his kidnapped daughter? Even to a higher level of regard in that he is not only the ruling monarch of that planet, which would lend even more reason for the empire to offer aid to the leader of one of the most prominent planets under their rule. I had previously questioned whether Bail ever truly cared for his daughter if he were to never install a tracker for his daughter, to have a security detail accompanying her at all times, or to even hire any bounty hunters, or to contact the very same Senate that he is a sitting member of. That he would be aware of the fact as to the location of his daughter and choose to send one of the most highly classed criminals to rescue her only confirms the point. How can it be that he is aware of her location while simultaneously stating to Obi-Wan in the previous episode that they had absolutely no leads, only to then backtrack 5 seconds later by naming the very same planet that his daughter was currently heading towards? Those inconsistencies aside, but that Bail would so casually mention that they were able to identify the ship by tracking its signature. To clarify, Bail has explicitly informed Obi-Wan that he is well aware of the type of ship that is carrying his kidnapped daughter due to having tracked it. How exactly was the ship tracked? Was Bail the one to do this? Was there a communication center on Alderaan that was called upon to search for nearby frequencies? Was there a scanner employed to identify any nearby frequencies of any ships leaving the planet? Did he send for someone to leave the planet to search for any nearby ships? How could Bail misinform Obi-Wan to such a degree by being so empty on information while simultaneously being so aware of the exact specifications of the very ship carrying his kidnapped daughter as to being able to provide Obi-Wan with a scanner that has the exact coordinates of the location of that planet? How could he have any of this information yet choose to ignore all of the resources at his disposal for the sake of hiring one of the most highly sought after criminals in the galaxy instead? How does any of this follow without any semblance of common sense being included? Why should anyone feel any measure of sympathy for this character if he is to go to the barest of lengths to save his daughter while not only contradicting his own words, but to a level of ignorance of such a high caliber that he could be unaware of the very words coming out of his mouth as he speaks? How does it follow that any audience member could be expected to believe this individual to be intelligent enough to be a senator, let alone the monarch of an entire planet, if he is so unaware as to the basics of human conversation? How destitute must the quality of a show made up of a budget of $90 million be if a video analyst with no money on YouTube is able to point out so many glaring issues based on the inability of a group of writers hired by one of the biggest commercial media enterprises to date? How much further must this franchise sink before it is too late? The employee with whom Obi-Wan had requested assistance from earlier informs Obi-Wan that now that he is in Daiyoo, that all corresponding signals both in and out are blocked, specifically that the people of Daiyoo prefer their secrets. That is quite an interesting statement made by this guard. What specifically about this planet makes it so that any signals going to or from the planet are blocked? Is it due to the atmosphere of what we had already seen as a cloudy storm-like planet? If that were indeed the case, then would the Empire not be aware of such an issue as blocked communications that they would want to address the issue to fix, as they have several squads stationed there? One would imagine that the Empire would want to maintain their authority across the galaxy, no matter the size or importance of the planets that they oversee. The implementation and registering that there would even be a block on any of their communications would be imperative in the facilitating the level of order on the planets that they control. Any band of suspicious activity would be heavily regulated to a point in tracking any ship entering or leaving that system. Not only in tracking outside personnel, but in continuing the direct line of communication of their own Imperial ships in that sector. Even the most basic form of regulating the comms channels and knowing what would be around the planet would be beneficial in knowing just what measure of security risks there may be surrounding the planet. If there was to be any enemy faction surrounding the planet, that they would be unaware of any possible threats simply because they chose to ignore the glaring issue of something so detrimental as any form of communication being blocked. There is an act of rebellion against the Empire. There could be an entire fleet surrounding the entirety of the planet of Daiyoo, yet the Empire would be so completely unaware as to the fact due to their error in being so lazy in not addressing the issue and not being able to send or receive any signals on that planet. Perhaps I'm getting too far ahead of myself, but for so many possibilities in exploring this world that it would be relegated to a mere throwaway line when you realize that that line carries such a degree of contrivance only for the sake of allowing Obi-Wan to escape the planet. Casual dialogue can either be the strongest facets by means of allocating information for your world building.
For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories.
We're here to further security objectives by collecting intelligence, providing useful analysis, and conducting effective covert action.
Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station.
Is the dark side stronger?
No. But busier, more seductive.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
A Jedi's strength flows from the Force.
You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
But beware of the dark side. Anger, fear, aggression. The dark side of the Force are they.
It's a ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
Security is an illusion. We are health care providers. We treat sickness. We identify symptoms. We locate germs, whether they arise from within or have come from the outside.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
The longer we wait to identify a disorder, the harder it is to treat the disease.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Or it can be so calamitous to the momentum of your story by forcing any throwaway lines to be the sole reason for why your characters are allowed to continue their journey.
Ryan delivered the script, I think, the first draft that everybody responded, Kathy and everybody in the studio responded super positively, probably like 13 or 14 months before we stopped filming.
How worried are you that you might also piss off people that are...
Can I just say though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, we got to think about the fans. Yeah. And he said, no, we got to think about the story and we got to think about our movie, which
We are then given several more establishing shots and, once again, I must at least commend the set designers for their implementations in using real-world locations for the basis of their set. An interesting detail in which I had learned in how this city was inspired by Hong Kong. This cityscape being just as alien to Obi-Wan as the many individuals inhabiting it, a far cry from the endless slopes of the barren planet in which he had once resided. Unfortunately, there can only be so many visuals to accompany your story before being downgraded simply for the sake of the story falling to such great lengths that a 15-second wide shot will carry more character in its display than the second episode, which lasted 38 minutes. Obi-Wan can only make his way through the crowds, attempting and keeping a low profile while simultaneously staying on the lookout to take note of anything important. While surveying the area, Obi-Wan comments,
"If ever I needed guidance, Master, it's now."
Another occurrence that carried such length of potential in exploring this character. Previously, we had seen Obi-Wan attempt to reach out to his former master after having awoken from his nightmare. Another point I had not brought forth in the previous episode was the issue that arose due to Obi-Wan's calling out to his master through the Force, with how ridiculous the idea that Obi-Wan would bury his lightsaber in the sand and cut himself off from the Force for the past 10 years, yet simultaneously attempting to rationalize his idiocy by stating that he was protecting Luke, despite choosing to forego the tools that he would need in order to do so. His calling out to his master is an issue in and of itself. If it were more to the point that he had only limited his usage of the Force rather than the actual severance of the connection to it, it would not have dealt the same level of damage as to what he had chosen to do instead. What needs to be addressed here is why he would even bother to call out to his former master in the first place, whether in the cave or currently while on this planet in the search for Leia. He is the one responsible for cutting off his connection to the Force. There was no other way to do this but being so consciously aware as to realize what he had done after the fact. Logic at its most basic form would dictate that there would be some level of awareness on Obi-Wan's part that he would know that calling out to his master through the Force would not work when he had already severed his connection to the Force. Supposing the possibility that he would re-establish his connection to the Force at those specific times, then one would wonder why he did not continue to maintain that connection at all. rather than cutting it off regardless. Should the counter to that be that either Darth Vader or the other Inquisitors would be able to sense Obi-Wan, then that reasoning would fall apart for the sole fact that Nari was able to locate Obi-Wan despite Obi-Wan's lack of connection to the Force. Even if Obi-Wan were to remain connected to the Force, the idea that the Inquisitors could sense Obi-Wan's presence would fall apart, as not even 3 Inquisitors were able to sense Nari's presence in the bar despite standing in the same area. How would it follow that 3 Inquisitors, one of whom was their leader, would be competent and able enough to locate Obi-Wan when he was hidden away in a cave several hundred miles away if those same individuals were unable to sense a Jedi sitting only 10 feet away from their location? After that moment of self-reflection, we hear a familiar voice call out to Obi-Wan. A clone trooper sits amongst the waste of the city, begging for spare credits to anyone sympathetic to help a grizzled veteran earn a warm meal. An intriguing tool in how films are able to incorporate cameos into the structure of their story and how they are able to build upon what was previously established. This, however, is of a different caliber. As previously stated, a single individual amongst hundreds that comprised the might of Darth Vader's army, the same army that had stormed the Jedi Temple upon the command of Order 66 being given. The inclusion of a clone trooper at this moment may have carried some measure of weight to the scene if not for the extent of convenience that one of the very soldiers tasked in murdering the Jedi would not be able to recognize one of the leading members of the Jedi Council at the height of the very same war that both of these individuals were a part of. Upon the formation of the Empire and the beginnings of the Imperial Army, clone troopers were deemed unfit to serve, ushering in a new era of troopers that enlisted from the many Imperial training academies spread across the galaxy. That the clone troopers whose genetic template was chosen so that a legion of troopers could be used to fight the very war that the Sith had coordinated in a systemic effort to wipe out the Jedi while bringing in a new era of order in the form of the Empire. How dark the subject matter could have been had it chosen to delve into exploring the life of a clone being created solely for the purpose of being forced into becoming nothing more than a puppet, a mere hollow copy of a human being, waiting beck and call for his next orders, only to be used in destroying the very leaders that they had served for years. All of this to be discarded in such a manner indicative of nothing more than the debris left over from the destruction of the war. All of this potential subject matter being degraded to nothing more than a cameo that lasted 25 seconds, with no interaction whatsoever other than to beg for any spare change. There is only a point that has been reached where the few remaining individuals that actually care anymore must beg for any scrap of consistency or characterization before being forced to accept what little meager rations of quality we can afford in potentiality versus the reality of what was given. As Obi-Wan continues his venture into the city, 2 stormtroopers take notice of Obi-Wan before continuing their patrol. With the level of priority and how far the Empire will go to locate any Jedi, that any individual would think that the Imperial Army would have been informed to recognize any high-profile target. More specifically, the Grand Jedi Master that had evaded the clones for over 10 years, including and most especially the very same Jedi who had killed the first Sith to appear in over a millennia, along with earning the rank of a Jedi Master amidst his status as a general in the very same Clone Wars that had brought upon the rise of the Empire. Even as the troopers glance at Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan then ignores any pretense of subtlety by choosing to take a moment to stare a little longer than necessary at the troopers passing by, which is not the best plan as he should be attempting to act in a manner that is not as suspicious as he is currently acting. The notion that this individual could be so nervous to such a degree that he would act in a manner such as this when we have seen that he had had absolutely no problem with being able to walk amongst and interact amongst any group of individuals while staying hidden on Tatooine. While employed in a different environment with the constant threat of the stormtroopers surveying the areas that they patrol, this is in actuality even less of a threat than on Tatooine, in which the Inquisitors have made it a habit to routinely patrol the planet in their constant searches for any remaining Jedi. A degree of cautiousness on the part of Obi-Wan would lend even the smallest modicum of common sense for this character in avoiding the wrath of the Inquisition, only for it to break apart upon his acting so outwardly irregular simply as an excuse for the show to facilitate any degree of tension that had never presented itself in the first place. As Obi-Wan continues on his way, he is stopped by a young adolescent who offers him several variations of drugs, to which he counters, stating that he needs information instead on locating his daughter, the cover story that he has decided upon in his effort in finding Leia. With how jittery this young woman had acted upon the initial exchange of dialogue with Obi-Wan before offering him several drugs, along with the constant presence of the stormtroopers on this planet, that one would presume that this individual would attempt to act more inconspicuous in her dealings. Why not simply have it that Obi-Wan stepped off to the side near a building in order to check the signal again before having this woman notice him? Having the exchange in a smaller locale would be more subtle as opposed to the attempt in making an illicit exchange in the very same public square that the 2 stormtroopers were only just patrolling only 10 seconds prior. Upon Obi-Wan's insistence in his request for information, the young woman then informs Obi-Wan that he should abandon his mission for the sake of there being no possibility of success in which he could search the entire planet for his daughter. Much like in Episode 1, it seems to be a recurring theme for characters to question where someone is only to then heed the response that they will have difficulty in finding their target, as that would mean having to search the entire planet. The young woman then makes an interesting comment.
I was someone's daughter once too.
Let's look at this just a bit deeper, shall we? Stating the idea that no one would ever leave the planet would open up so many different avenues in the meaning behind this statement. What facet of this world would make it impossible that no one would be able to leave the planet? Would the work and pay conditions be so poor that no one would be afforded the opportunity to leave? Does this planet not offer many or even any opportunities for transport off-world? Would Imperial security be to such an extreme caliber that the locals would prefer to avoid any entanglements lest they risk saying the wrong thing and suffering? All of these opportunities in exploring how this planet operates in regards to the local life and how it coalesces into the broader aspect in living a life under the imperialistic regime. That so many simple lines made by so many random individuals that we would never see again, offering so many options and discovering more about this universe, only to continuously be sidelined for the narrative to rear its ugly head back and continue to preach to its audience about how intelligent it is on such a level of superficiality. The young woman then states that she was once someone's daughter too before giving Obi-Wan a vial of drugs for free, stating that any more of them would help him in forgetting he ever had a daughter. What is perplexing yet again is why so many characters that have been introduced in these stories and not only being created so that the main character may continue on their journey, all for the sake of that random individual having committed any such act that would end up aiding that protagonist by such flimsy means without having emerged organically for the sake of the plot needing to continue. In this instance, why must it be that the end goal for organizations such as these be that any story told in the near future must be connected to the main storyline without actually considering any other alternatives and exploring any other area of this galaxy? In that the opportunity for a story of a young woman being abandoned by her parents, being forced to survive under the authority of a totalitarian military dictatorship, having been forced into such a position to sell drugs without attracting notice from the faceless entity of the Imperial forces. All of this in a desperate effort to make the bare minimum in being able to survive. That this young woman would end up giving several vials of the very substances that she is selling in order to survive for free to a random individual simply because the plot required for that very event to occur is ridiculous. Instead, we were given a brief cameo by Ewan McGregor's daughter in a role designed only to have Obi-Wan escape a scenario that he should never have found himself in the first place, if only for the complete incompetence in the writers in being unable to write any Star Wars episode without including any scene without having first involved any measure of contrivance. Obi-Wan then encounters a young girl who informs him that a nearby Jedi would be able to aid Obi-Wan in exchange for the right price. As if it wasn't already so convenient enough that this one girl that would have ties to a Jedi would overhear that very same individual stating to a young woman who would inevitably end up helping him simply because she was foolish enough to give away the one resource that was her livelihood for free to that same individual. That he would need help in locating his daughter just so that the plot could occur is not what constitutes good writing, nor does it lend credence to what would account for even a shred of credibility. Any instance inconvenience in any extent must be considered to a point in how deliberate it is, specifically in how it pertains to the story and the way in which it can be so easily determined how one would be able to tell the difference between a minor commonality versus being the sole reason that the plot would be able to continue at all. In this instance, a young girl finding and conversing with a former Jedi Master and offering the aid of another Jedi simply for the sake of that former Jedi being able to locate the daughter of whom one of the Inquisitors surmised was the daughter of the individual whom she believed to be the longtime friend of the very same Jedi she is hunting. Contrary to what the target audience for those shows may believe, but that is not what one could reasonably assume to hold any scope of subtlety, intellect, capability, or integrity. If anything, it is the bare minimum for what one might expect of a first draft, not for what was displayed in the final script. Then again, is it really all too surprising the individuals that Disney would hire anymore to write their stories? But I digress. The idea that any surviving Jedi in a post-Jedi era offers some amount of intrigue to facilitate the progression of this story, if not for the mechanics of how it could have been so poorly manufactured that a surviving Jedi would continue in their attempt to offer whatever support to those individuals in need of it at the risk of their freedom and life. The idea of a Jedi who has been forced to a point in his attempt at surviving that he would only be willing to help people for just the right amount of credits rather than on the basis of morality. That a character as virtuous as a Jedi would make the decision to commit to such heinous crimes and smuggling under the Empire in order to make a quick credit. that Obi-Wan would be able to encounter one Jedi in the previous episode that still believed in the eventual return of the Jedi Order versus the possibility of meeting a Jedi in this episode that has been forced into such a position of committing crimes against the Empire in order to survive, both of which carry differing ideologies that would allow for Obi-Wan to reassess not only the Jedi Order as a whole, but the way in which the principles in which he had been raised upon could so easily be swept aside for the sole purpose of surviving under the evil regime of the Empire. The exploration and desperation for survival versus morality. Much like before, it was only a brief glimpse into another possible story that would have never been achieved simply for the sake of choosing this story that it only ended up leading to yet another contradiction in the previous establishment of what had come before. Barring those issues aside for the moment, but the matter in which this little girl would so blatantly go up to random strangers and question them if they required any assistance from a Jedi. As it has been established with how anti-Jedi the Empire is, that the citizens of the Galactic Empire would be so fearful as to have any correspondence or level of relation to the very enemy that they have been bred to fear. Only for this little girl to go around asking any random individual if they were to require any assistance from the very same enemy that could get them killed, simply for the sake of the plot occurring. With how desperate enough that so many of the planets and civilians in this galaxy are for resources such as food, water, and money, let alone their very lives under the rule of the Empire, that they wouldn't think to turn in anyone whom they believed to be associated with a Jedi. Episode 1 had already shown Reva threatening the locals of Tatooine into giving up the location of the Jedi that they were searching for lest Owen suffer the ultimate price, only for Obi-Wan to go up to that same individual after the fact and thank him. As any individual would be able to rightly assume that this individual who was hiding that had decided to thank that same man who had been accused of hiding the enemy must have been the same individual that the Empire was hunting. What if this specific individual that the little girl had asked had instead been an undercover spy for the Empire or a stormtrooper or officer off duty? As we had seen multiple times in A New Hope, the Empire would have absolutely no qualms in any measure of hesitating to take down any individuals that they feel would pose a threat to the Empire, let alone maintaining any semblance of contact with those individuals. So it should not stand to reason that Obi-Wan should be so willing and openly trusting of this random stranger who had asked him if he required assistance from a Jedi. Especially given the fact that Obi-Wan has cut himself off from the Force for the last 10 years and cannot rely on it at any moment's notice should the situation necessitate it. That Obi-Wan would be choosing to walk into any area without any degree of cautiousness while only being able to rely on the blind trust of others is not the precedent that should be set if the overall goal is to showcase this individual in being able to rely upon his instincts, intelligence, and eventually, his reliance on the Force in order to succeed if it is to only continue to display this character in such a manner of unrelenting ignorance and stupidity. Obi-Wan then follows the girl to a different area where we see the previously mentioned Jedi openly use the Force to shut several of the gates surrounding the perimeter of the room in order to secure any measure of privacy. However, despite barring part of the open holes in the wall that it would constitute a new problem for the very fact that any outside observer would be so curious as to why several of these gates would close so suddenly. That aside, that any outside observer could so casually glance in and take notice of a robed figure moving around many objects telekinetically that it would not immediately compromise that individual's position. The Jedi then uses the Force once more to retrieve his comm in front of this mother and her son. Much like the argument before, but if this little girl is to go around so brazenly and asking random civilians if they require assistance from a Jedi that upon those civilians meeting this Jedi, why these civilians would not attempt to turn this Jedi in for a reward. Using the example of the mother and son here, if this mother is so desperate to escape this planet that she would risk being captured and killed for fraternizing with the Jedi, then what was there to stop her from turning in this Jedi for an even higher reward from the Empire considering how willing the Empire is in offering rewards for those highly classed criminals? The idea of someone posing as a Jedi in order to reel in the benefits of those desperate enough to seek his aid in exchange for such a high level of monetary gain is quite the risky predicament if that info were ever to be leaked to the Empire. Especially when one would stop to consider that this individual's method in seeking those desperate enough for help is by means of recruiting a 10-year-old girl and having her randomly question strangers at such a crowded villa where there are stormtroopers currently stationed. If the stormtroopers or even the Inquisitors were to find out about the possibility of a Jedi having been discovered in that area, they would have not immediately hesitated to seek out and capture this individual. What is worse lies there in the fact that if they were to discover that he was not Force sensitive, that there would still be such a high chance of this individual being killed due to having wasted the time, energy, and resources of the Empire and the Inquisitors. Let alone the very fact that this individual posing as a Jedi would increase the likelihood in those civilians in the surrounding area hearing rumors of the Jedi returning that it would spur dissent within the Empire, that it would cause trouble for this planet if the hot-tempered Inquisitors were to arrive on that planet searching for a Jedi. only to discover an imposter who in turn would cause them to harm any other innocent civilians in a blinded rage for being led on a wild bantha chase that led to nowhere. Reva from the previous episode being a clear example of the very fact that there would be no measure of guilt in any innocent civilian being harmed simply for their own justifications. That this mother would even state to this individual that the force is so strong within him that it would only cause one to question the validity and the notion that if this individual was able to fool this mother into thinking that he was a Jedi, that the mother would not have been so grateful and in awe of his abilities that she would have then chosen to tell anyone else of the Jedi who was able to allow for a safe passage off of that planet. That this Jedi informing the mother that she must forget lest they risk his safety is even more of a contrived setup, as it would be all the more difficult to do that based on the likelihood of the Inquisitors in discovering this same mother and extracting the info from her mind, thus in turn leading to the derailment of this individual's operation and lead to his eventual death. A small but interesting detail during this exchange between the charlatan and the mother and her child is in Obi-Wan's observations in viewing how this individual operates. As a former Force user that would be able to recognize another Force-sensitive individual's ability to call upon the Force, that he would be able to recognize the difference between its actual application versus an obvious ruse. Another interesting detail to mention is this imposter's comment about the mother and her child in the regard of her child having a measure of Force sensitivity. Upon informing the mother of the landing gate that they must go to after fooling them of his ability to use a Jedi mind trick of the man he called on the comm to allow them safe passage, he lets the mother know that she must be careful, lest the Empire discover them due to her son's latent abilities on the Force. How interesting of a dynamic could have been in the idea that an individual posing as a Jedi would attempt to fool an actual Force-sensitive child to the credibility of whether or not this child would be able to recognize that this imposter carries no level of connection to the Force. As we had seen in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, that upon Anakin's test in front of the Jedi Council and showcasing his awareness of and ability to harness the Force, that this specific child may or may not have been able to see through the ruse. Whether he were to indeed see through it, but only held back in exposing him for the simple fact of wanting to escape the planet as quickly as possible as to not inform his mother. How interesting the idea in that an imposter would pose as a Jedi for the sake of making a living carried such a measure of potentiality and role building and telling a story in these other individuals that would unfortunately, much like every other new character, be introduced only for the express purpose of allowing the story to continue so inorganically.
What did you bring to your character that you hope connects with the fans?
Well, for me, I think everyone here would know this, but a lot of the kind of less super fans wouldn't, that the Grand Inquisitor used to be a Jedi. So, to me, that's like super important for this.
I think that's a tough one. I think she aims to please in more ways than one. And yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
What the hell are you talking about? Who are you talking to?
I want to talk, if you don't mind, about the significance of being a Black woman in the Star Wars universe.
Please shut up.
What it means for the series, what it means for you as an actor, what it means for young girls out there who are going to turn on this series and see someone who looks like them. Can you talk about the importance and the weight behind that?
What the hell are you talking about?
You know, representation is so important, and this franchise is one of the biggest, and I feel blessed that I get to be the vessel through which Reva comes to life. And I know it's going to mean so much to so many little girls to turn on this screen and see someone who looks like them being as powerful and dangerous. And I mean, yeah, she's a villain, but you know, I remember growing up and watching TV with my brothers, like, no, it's for boys, or you're not strong enough, you know. But it's like, with this, it's like, yeah, you can fight like a girl, but still be strong and still be dangerous. It's not a downplay. It's like, yeah, I fight like a girl because I'm bad.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
I just also really quickly want to touch on, because I read about this and I thought it was fantastic, the significance of not changing your hair for the show and the positive message that sends all people out there, not young people or any particular race, but everybody.
You're an idiot.
Oh, it's so important. You know, there's so many little girls out there, like you said, of every race who have kinky hair or hair that like does not get straight. You know what I mean? And
I don't know what is going on.
It was really important for me, for my character to have hair that does what it does. You know, the initial design, it was something that my hair just can't do, and I would feel so lame if it came time to Halloween and some kid wanted to be me somewhere and they had to put on a wig because I had to put on a wig, you know what I mean? But, you know, the braids sort of eliminate that, and so many people now can just rock it how it goes, you know?
Don't embarrass yourself. Don't you have family who watch television?
Because we got to redefine what like a girl means. Because we got to redefine what like a girl means. Because we got to redefine what like a girl means.
There's something wrong with you. That's my judgment. Goodbye.
It's a ride, I tell you what. It's amazing. It's just this complete party all day and all night, probably.
What does it mean to just be a part of Star Wars?
It feels like being invited to the greatest party that you hadn't ever really imagined was going on. And then you got an invite and you turn up and it's like people you don't know but instantly become great friends.
Yep. Welcome to the family.
Obi-Wan then introduces himself, only for Haja, the imposter, to become startled and question Obi-Wan as to how he had gotten in that area. How confusing that this individual would not have already been aware of the person in whom the girl he had employed as a partner would not have called forth beforehand to inform him to expect a new customer. Is it not the express purpose of her job in finding any such individual that would require the aid of this man that she would not think to inform her employer, this imposter, that she had acquired a new customer for him only to forgo any measure of contacting him before the customer's arrival? Obi-Wan then requests aid from Haja, in which Haja informs Obi-Wan of his purpose, in aiding any and all who require it for a small fee for his being forced to hide in the shadows as the light above would expose his identity. In what little interaction there is between the two of them, it is nice that even 5% of continuity could be applied in showcasing Obi-Wan's old wittiness re-emerging through his sarcasm in confronting the imposter, and not having been so easily duped like those before. He then exposes Haja, infuriated over the fact that this charlatan had stolen money from a desperate mother. What could have built towards a moment to build upon the re-establishment for this character would have carried any level of sentiment towards the character of Obi-Wan if not for the very fact that he was present for the exchange between the fake Jedi and the mother. Yet he had chosen to do nothing but watch during the entirety of that exchange. Perhaps in the idea that it was only to ensure that the mother would not turn in the charlatan if Obi-Wan were to expose him, if not for the very fact that he still allowed the extortion to occur regardless. It is only in a jarring moment in which Obi-Wan draws out his blaster in pushing the man into helping him to locate Leia. The idea of a darker, desperate Obi-Wan is all too similar of what had been displayed of a bitter, cynical, older Luke Skywalker, in the sense that both would carry infinite possibilities in the progression of their character and understanding how those individuals were ever brought to such a point. Unfortunately for Luke, the explanation given was that his nephew had an inclination towards the dark side, which caused Luke to consider murdering his nephew in his sleep, as it has become an unfortunate commonality for any sequel defender to sink so low that they would even attempt to compare the moment in which Luke attempted to strike down Ben in the same vein of Luke attacking Vader in Episode 6 as beyond ridiculous. What those individuals would only continue to fail to realize in that one moment, in that the rebellion was on the brink of annihilation, the state of the galaxy was at hand, and Vader had threatened in coercing the only member of Luke's family that remained to the dark side, to which an enraged Luke would emerge in a blinded fury at such an implication. In the instance of The Last Jedi, Luke had only sensed his nephew being drawn to the dark side, but rather than considering any other possibility in addressing his nephew to such matters in an attempt in explaining the dangers of the dark side, Luke decided that the best possible alternative would have been to entertain the notion of murdering a child in his sleep. There is absolutely no comparison whatsoever, and it is only so baffling that anyone would ever only continue to defend the very thought, let alone ever having made the conscious effort in attempting to defend the act at all. With Obi-Wan threatening an individual to the point that he would point the barrel of a blaster directly into his chest of what is being exhibited as a measure of desperation that could have been explored in a way that would have led Obi-Wan to this point. The possibility in which could have been justified in only being because he was persuaded by Bail to do so, that it would only be justified if we had actually seen any of the events that had led up to the way in which Obi-Wan would have expressed any such changes in his methods to his character. Not even so necessarily constituted by the fact that Bail had persuaded Obi-Wan to do so when you stop to consider in the fact of how Obi-Wan had never wanted to leave Tatooine in the first place. Guilting someone into committing any such act against their better wishes, or even to their character, is not a logical progression of what had previously been established, but rather a cheap imitation of it. When Obi-Wan breaks the man's devices in which he had used to fool his customers, we see a brief flash of anger in Haja before he suddenly agrees in aiding Obi-Wan. It is rather surprising how ready, willing, and able Obi-Wan would be to trust the same individual who had extorted a mother and a child, along with how angry Haja had become immediately after Obi-Wan had destroyed his magnets. Even Obi-Wan is briefly surprised at this sudden change, despite the level of suspicion in the way Haja was acting previously. But much as it has become a habit for Disney to make any morally compromised individual in their stories to so suddenly be revealed to be good individuals simply because they couldn't be bothered to include any characters that would carry even an iota of selfishness, greed, or evil in their character. It's not too surprising anymore, and it will only continue to be forced simply for their payoffs that will never be earned. We then see an alien rat, which is an obvious attempt at creating any symbolism as a point of reference for the moment in which Obi-Wan had called Haja a rat previously, when only coming off as so desperate for how obvious it is in the attempt of the writers in displaying what they believe to be clever writing.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
Please come back, George. As Obi-Wan walks amongst the crowd, he then spots a civilian cosplaying as Walter White, to whom he follows before assaulting him and stealing his clothing. One might wonder why Obi-Wan would not have been bothered to have been dressed in such a manner as this beforehand, as it would have been far more preferable and advantageous in maintaining his anonymity. But that would be a step towards logical progression, and we all know how Disney feels about that. As Obi-Wan makes his way through Walter's basement, we witness firsthand several of the workers and their handling of the chemicals that they are working with. Yet another brief moment in what is being presented and showcased in the day-to-day life of the ordinary civilian in this universe and attempting to make a living in dealing with hazardous chemicals, being yet another alternative storyline and exploring the base concepts for how this world and its inhabitants would work. All to be brushed aside yet again in witnessing the degradation of these characters. In regards to the workers in this room, what is curious here lies therein that no one had taken notice of the new individual walking amongst their area. Would they not recognize the fact that this individual is not one of their co-workers? Or is it to be that one of the workers has the exact same height, build, beard, and long hair as Obi-Wan? If that were indeed the case, then that would be quite convenient for Obi-Wan, now wouldn't it? As indicative as the quality has become that Obi-Wan would act so suspicious in looking around the room before causing an explosion that no one would seem to identify as having been caused by Obi-Wan, that it has only become so unbelievably ridiculous at that point. All to such a degree that one of the workers had gone to inspect the explosion that he would not have even bothered in noticing the glaringly obvious attempt in someone stealing his keycard when that same individual was standing directly in front of him. For as non-existent as his connection to the Force may have become, it is good to know that Obi-Wan's plot armor will only ever continue to be so strong. Obi-Wan is then confronted by two of the workers who inform him to return to his post, to which Obi-Wan immediately attacks. For some reason, after Obi-Wan had knocked down the first individual, the Zabrak worker simply stood in place before continuing his attack. Even after having witnessed Obi-Wan having been stunned from the blow, rather than capitalizing on his opponent's temporary weakness, the Zabrak worker simply stands in place and lets Obi-Wan turn around instead of immediately having taken advantage of the opportunity he had to defeat his opponent. Why Obi-Wan would have allowed for himself to be so open to any attack for such a period of time that would have led to having been incapacitated is ridiculous enough. What is even more conceited here is in just how much plot armor Obi-Wan continues to display. It is only by such a degree of luck that this individual was not to have been carrying any sort of weapon on his person, that if this worker were to have drawn a blaster to stun Obi-Wan, or even to kill him, that Obi-Wan would have been captured or died simply for the sake of his incompetence and standing still in a fight that he himself had initiated in the first place. The second henchman then throws a series of kicks which only continues to show how bad the choreography of this show is. The henchman throws one kick to which Obi-Wan counters. However, before the henchman had thrown his second kick, Obi-Wan had already moved his arm to the position that he would have needed to in order to counter the attack before it had even begun. This may have been countered for the fact that the Force is an established presence in this universe and being a tool that the Jedi are able to harness in order to hone their senses. However, the issue with that solution lies in the fact that up to this point, Obi-Wan had severed his connection to the Force and had not yet regained his ability to utilize that connection, as he had had absolutely no way in being able to use the Force to predict his opponent's attacks, let alone in heightening his senses. That this should not have been possible for the fact that he was already countering the moves before they had even been performed. Perhaps the most unbelievable component of this fight is that Obi-Wan was able to even win the bout between these two workers, let alone even match their ability to fight competently when one would stop to remember that he had not maintained any sort of physical regimen or training over the last decade. If he did indeed continue to train physically for the last 10 years, then would it have not been prudent for the showrunners to establish that up front, let alone in any capacity at all? How would this constitute any level of credibility in the idea that Obi-Wan would choose to stay physically fit but deter from any method in training with his lightsaber or continuing to develop, let alone have any sort of connection to the Force? If he would indeed go to any length to maintain a physical regimen in order to protect Luke, would it not have been more beneficial to his mission if he were to utilize the Force and his lightsaber as well? How would it possibly be believable that the writers could honestly expect for anyone to accept the notion that if any danger were to arise in calling for Obi-Wan to protect Luke, that he would succeed only with his fists rather than the Force and his lightsaber? That something as feasible as a Tusken Raider approaching the Lars homestead with a rifle, would we be expected to believe that a pair of fists could beat a long-ranged weapon instead of the Force or a lightsaber? Then again, it is not too surprising altogether anymore when one recalls and how this is the exact same story in which any enemy capable of carrying any long-ranged weapons would choose to run up to their targets rather than maintaining the advantage in distance. After his brief victory over the workers in which Obi-Wan was able to ascertain Leia's location, upon discovering the ruse, Obi-Wan is then ambushed by the two henchmen from the forest. How these henchmen knew when and where Obi-Wan would be in order to capture him is quite convenient. But why should any of this matter for any of these writers when they have the element of convenience on their side? The lead henchman then comments how he is surprised at not only how a Jedi would be able to bleed, but in that how surprising it was that Obi-Wan even fell for the ruse in the first place. It is almost to a point of irony that this leader would utter that line for the sake of mirroring the thoughts of any rational being at how stupid Obi-Wan could have been. All of this to occur before the lead henchman had taken Obi-Wan's lightsaber.
What?
We have several things to discuss. In my critique for episode 1, I had pointed out how unbelievably idiotic these henchmen were for their inability in being able to catch up to a 10-year-old child running in the woods, constantly interweaving through a series of poorly placed action shots detailing the inability of the henchmen in being able to step over the smallest of branches while simultaneously ignoring the trees that they chose to run into. All for the supposed notion that Leia would be resourceful in evading these henchmen, when only for the end result of making any intelligent human being die inside and having witnessed such an intellectually offensive and outright pathetic portrayal of these clueless idiots, that the director would even attempt to persuade anyone that those very same henchmen carried the necessary level of brain cells to recognize Obi-Wan as a Jedi rather than any of the stormtroopers patrolling that very same area when they are what make up the might of the army of the Galactic Empire is insane. The second issue to be raised is the level of awareness on the part of its characters in this universe. For Nari, upon his discovery by the Inquisitors, he had immediately tried to escape the area before being cornered by the Inquisitors. Reva in particular, due to her having drawn her lightsaber to attack. He had simply stood in place and allowed for Reva to attack him, only being allowed to escape due to the questionable actions of the Grand Inquisitor. He had encountered Obi-Wan later that night and presented his lightsaber as an indicator of his status as a Jedi. Why he did not choose to use his lightsaber against the Inquisitors earlier was already confusing enough, but for these henchmen to recognize Obi-Wan as the Jedi that they were searching for, that they would be aware of his status as a Jedi would indicate to these henchmen that this is an individual with whom they would need to tread careful ground with, while the fact that Obi-Wan had cut himself off from the Force would be an advantage to these individuals if they were to be well aware of the fact. However, as they were not aware of that very fact, as they believed that this individual still carried the ability to use the Force, then that should have been even further incentive in wanting to incapacitate this individual, that they were to be so very aware of the power levels of the Inquisitors, the same group of individuals that carry such a limited knowledge of the Force that they would need to rely on carrying helicopter lightsabers, which we will most definitely get into later, don't you worry. Then the mere fact that they would be standing in front of a Grand Jedi Master should have them worried on such a level that they would want to take any and all preventative measures to subdue him, whether it be cuff restraints, using a stun blaster, or even simply knocking him out. Naturally, the most intelligent decision for these henchmen would be in their deciding for a completely separate alternative and choosing to monologue at such great lengths without restraining his hands whatsoever. All without having taken his gun while simultaneously holding his lightsaber 1 foot away from him. Then again, is it really so off-putting the lack of intelligence being displayed here when being presented with the same individuals that were unable to catch up to a 10-year-old child, despite being fully grown adults with the options and having complete access to any such weapons that would have immediately rendered their opponents immobilized provided by the very same Inquisitor working for the Galactic Empire? For the entirety of the length of time in which these henchmen have held his lightsaber, have held him in place, and continued to monologue, has Obi-Wan still decided that not using the Force was his best option at that point, despite the very fact that that would have been the very tool necessary to survive, retrieve his lightsaber, and ensure the success of his mission. But I suppose the lesson to take away from all of this is to only ever do nothing and let convenience take over. Speaking of convenience, with the two henchmen pointing guns on either side of Obi-Wan's head, that they would not have immediately opened fire the moment that Obi-Wan had made any sort of movement, let alone being able to reach into his pocket, grab the vials of spice, hold it out in front of the lead henchman, make a joke, and be allowed to throw it onto the ground in order to escape. Not only being so ludicrous in its sheer virility and having chosen to display such a series of events to such a degree of stupidity, but even more convenient in that Obi-Wan had chosen not to rely on the Force and mind-tricking the henchmen into forgetting his involvement, but to instead rely on a MacGuffin in accomplishing the very thing that he required. How unreliable is it that Obi-Wan would choose to rely on that drug when the young woman from earlier had specifically stated that one dose of the spice would not be enough, but in that he would need several more in order to effectively wipe the mind? This is only continuing to fracture the very logistics of the rules that the writers had chosen to insert into the plot without them even comprehending what had just occurred. How indicative and how problematic the story must be if the very tool that the writers had constructed is the same one that they had forgotten, and how it would serve their story when they themselves had set the parameters in the first place. Reva then arrives. Before passing through the gate, a civilian attempts to block her path before Reva draws her weapon and threatening the man to move. If this individual was able to recognize the weapon that Reva was holding, then surely he would have identified this specific individual in carrying those particular weapons and discerning their connection to the Empire. One cannot work without the other. Obi-Wan then enters another room before being assaulted by Leia, who attempts to escape before Obi-Wan catches her. It's almost as if the show is actually making the attempt and showing that a fully grown adult can indeed catch up to a small child. After Obi-Wan catches her, Leia then questions Obi-Wan as to his identity, which is quite curious how immediately calm she had become despite having thrown such a fit only 5 seconds previously in her attempt to escape. Obi-Wan then informs her that her father had sent him to rescue her before she very snarkily, yet rightly questions where the army is. She then asks him why she should trust him. Would it not have been beneficial for Obi-Wan to inform Leia of his connection to Bail? Better yet, why did Bail not give Obi-Wan something to pass along to Leia to ensure Leia's trust in knowing that this individual that had come to rescue her was indeed a companion of her father? As cliché as it may have been, perhaps a piece of jewelry or a token that Leia could have identified in verifying the connection and knowing that this individual was indeed in contact with her father, rather than just having Obi-Wan not answer her question by asking a question of his own instead. After departing the building, we see Obi-Wan and Leia navigating their way through the area in their disguises. It is a minute but effective detail in presenting just how well these individuals would have been able to have so easily blended in with their environment, as opposed to earlier in having Obi-Wan having made the questionable decision to go on his mission while donning his Jedi robes while acting in such a suspicious manner. Reva then arrives and begins her interrogation in demanding Obi-Wan's location. As they continue, Obi-Wan deduces that they need to change. While it would be beneficial on the part of Obi-Wan, as he would not want to risk him and Leia wearing the same clothing from the same building that they had just escaped from, it would not follow that he would choose to change right in the open square when he has his lightsaber exposed to such a high degree. I would like to briefly remind everyone that per the first episode of Kenobi, that Bria had informed Leia that if she were only more well behaved that she would have already achieved her status as a senator due to her level of intellect. So how is it to be expected that that same individual that could be so intelligent would so blatantly question this individual as to his status as a Jedi on the very same planet that is overrun by stormtroopers, all the while attempting to avoid the same henchmen that they had only just escaped from? Leia attempts to justify this lunacy when she states that Obi-Wan seems old and beat up. This statement coming out of nowhere considering that Obi-Wan is roughly the same age as Bail, if not slightly younger. Instead of immediately continuing on their way and escaping the planet full of stormtroopers, inquisitors, and henchmen, Obi-Wan decides to take the time to explain to Leia their destination. Despite her enthusiasm, Leia is so easily startled by a passing alien before Obi-Wan informs her to simply follow his orders. What is interesting here is in how Obi-Wan had rebuked Leia for her referral to him as a Jedi in such a public area, yet he did not think twice about choosing to refer to Leia as her title of princess when standing in that exact same area as before.
You have no idea what I'm risking being here, Your Highness.
At this point, the Grand Inquisitor, the fifth brother, and a new Inquisitor arrive. The Grand Inquisitor confronts Reva for her plan in kidnapping the daughter of an Imperial Senator, which does indeed follow in such a logical fashion as the Grand Inquisitor would be so aware as to how tactless, idiotic, and illegal Reva's plan was. Reva's response to that is,
"We've done worse."
As if any rationalization in attempting to justify being such an abhorrent individual would carry any excuse for having conceived such a comically senseless plan without having informed anyone of the fact before implementing the idea. The Grand Inquisitor rightfully points out how nonsensical it was that she had never made the distinction to inform anyone of her plans before she informs them how she had discovered the link between Bail and Obi-Wan in the Imperial archives, and in how she had used the girl as bait in order to lure Obi-Wan out of hiding. We are then given a brief glimpse of the new Inquisitor. not only her presence in sticking out amongst the others for its distinct design, but in her ability in instilling any level of intrigue without having spoken a single word despite her brethren having failed to project any measure of fear or control prior to her appearance. All of this to show how she had already achieved in 2 seconds what the 1.5 episodes of the current Inquisitors we had already bore witness to had failed to do so. When the Grand Inquisitor questions why Reva did not inform anyone of her plans, the third sister explains how she had been left with no other choice, which is simply laughable when considering that she had never even bothered, let alone made the attempt, to inform the Inquisitors or anyone else of the idea in devising a plan to lure out one of the Empire's most highly wanted criminals. The fifth brother then remarks how Reva had believed that she would have gained favor in capturing Kenobi. That we have reached a point that the story would be explained outright by one of the Inquisitors as he looks directly into the camera shows just how deficient this media has become if the writers would be so apprehensive in allowing for the audience to form their own conclusions based on the evidence given. The Grand Inquisitor states that no matter her desires, nothing will change how far beneath she is to the rest of the Inquisitors. Take that statement as you will. The Grand Inquisitor informed Reva that she came from nothing but the gutter, that her abilities were what allowed for her to acquire any position of power. As stated before, exposition for the sake of building your story and characters can work quite favorably if not for having delivered it on the premise and having your characters being handed information that they were already aware of. Having the Grand Inquisitor informing the third sister of her past is not conducive in establishing any connection or arc if he is to inform her of what she is already aware of. That he would so blatantly inform her that no measure of power would be able to hide her stench, to which she offers the rebuttal that the only stench present is of his own failure. What is presented as a line that the writers attempted to come off as intimidating and intelligent is what could only come off as insulting to any intelligent individual to recognize as what would have amounted to an insult uttered by a third grader on the playground. That they have resorted to this level of phrasing as to be expected of what any 9-year-old child would spout off shows just how far we have come. In the justification that the Grand Inquisitor has removed the third sister from her position and how she claims that she was the one to lure Kenobi to that planet, all the while continuing to fail to grasp the success of her plan, only ever relying on the sheer idiocy of having kidnapped an Imperial Senator's daughter going completely over her head. All of this to be based on the information that she discovered in the Imperial archives without bothering to inform the very same Empire that she is a part of. Instead, the Grand Inquisitor merely informs Reva of her imminent punishment upon their return. The Inquisitors then leave in their search for Kenobi, all the while leaving Reva behind, all the while trusting her to not do anything rash. For only just having relieved Reva of her position, it is a wonder why the Inquisitors would not have thought to remove Reva of her lightsaber while escorting her back to the ship in order to ensure her being out of the way while they continued their search. Speaking of Reva not doing anything rash or impulsive, Reva then decides to impulsively make the rash decision to make a call to the henchmen and demanding that they contact all bounty hunters in the immediate area to search for Kenobi. It's almost as if everything that the Grand Inquisitor had warned her not to do never truly sank in. In regards to Reva's orders, the henchmen question her as to whether she truly believes that those individuals would be competent enough to catch a Jedi. An interesting question coming from the same individual that struggled to catch up to and capture a 10-year-old child running through the woods, but semantics I suppose. Reva then remarks that she does not want Obi-Wan to be captured, but instead to be squeezed, that this will cause Obi-Wan to be drawn out, thus allowing for her to locate and capture him. While the idea of coercing a large measure of bounty hunters and capturing Obi-Wan contains some level of merit, the writers have once again ignored the fundamentals of the mechanics of their story if they are to forget the fact that Force-sensitive individuals are able to recognize other Force users. Then again, the consistency has become so flawed if 3 Inquisitors were unable to recognize the Force signature of a Jedi sitting 10 feet from their position as opposed to that same Jedi being able to locate Obi-Wan several hundred miles away from the town that he was avoiding. That this Inquisitor would not think to use the most convenient and powerful tool at her disposal only continues to display this character as so lacking in any mental capacity. That Reva would state that she does not want Obi-Wan to be captured but squeezed, only to then state that she wants Obi-Wan located so that she could capture him. As nonsensical as Reva's logic is, it only highlights another issue. After having given her demands in locating Kenobi, the henchmen are then seen uploading Obi-Wan's image to the transponders of those bounty hunters in the surrounding area. That the Jedi have been labeled as enemies of the Empire to such a degree that any recognition of those individuals would lead to their immediate capture and death. That Reva is only now uploading his image to the servers on this planet after 10 years is so questionable as to why she would never have thought to do so 10 years prior to the current events. If she was so well aware to the notion that kidnapping a senator's daughter would inevitably lead to his re-emergence, would she not have already chosen to inform those same bounty hunters to be on the lookout for that specific individual? Would she not choose to inform the very same stormtroopers patrolling that planet, the very same stormtroopers that comprise the might of the very same organization that she is a part of, the very same stormtroopers who have been established in carrying blasters that are capable of stunning their opponents immediately that there would be a Jedi in their midst? How is it that she was ever able to earn her position in the first place, let alone maintain it for so long for the sake of making such detrimental errors? If the Grand Inquisitor's line about her usage of the Force being the only justification for it, surely he would have attempted in training her to a degree and not making those same mistakes. We then see several of the bounty hunters receiving the transmission which, again, could and should have already been distributed to these individuals prior to these events occurring for the increased likelihood in locating their target. But as it must be that it is far too gone too late to be properly utilized in showing our heroes applying their intellect to escape this situation rather than due to the laziness and inefficiency of the enemy faction in being aware of their targets. Obi-Wan takes note of the hunters having received his image, which causes some exasperation on Obi-Wan's part despite the fact that this could have all been avoided if he had simply left his respirator from earlier on and giving him even 10% more anonymity, rather than foregoing any disguise just so that the drama may play out. They then finally arrive to a venue selling several articles of clothing, which is just adding to the pile of conveniences already shown. Obi-Wan then purchases a green cloak for Leia along with some gloves. Why he would not buy something to cover their faces would have been prudent in maintaining their anonymity. Even if there were no scarves or masks, something as simple as buying a slightly larger rope for Leia to wrap around her face would have been an easy enough explanation in remedying this problem. It is quite the interesting ensemble that Obi-Wan had chosen for Leia. It's almost as if the writers could not help themselves in making yet another reference. Obi-Wan then informs Leia of their cover story, that should anyone ask, that they are farmers from the planet Tol and that they are father and daughter. Leia then snidely remarks that Obi-Wan would be more akin to being a grandfather. Why she would choose to say something so asinine and insulting to the same man who she is aware is risking both his identity as a Jedi and his life in rescuing her is beyond any reasoning. How can it be that this character was meant to be written as morally correct and standing up against any form of bigotry in the previous episode to then go on to insult the same man who is willing to die to save her? How is it possible to make this many contradictions to this character before the entirety of the second episode is even over? Why not have the conversation go in the direction that as Obi-Wan begins to inform Leia of the plan, that she would then choose to interrupt Obi-Wan in order to implement her own input to the conversation? Why not have Obi-Wan say, "If anyone asks, we're farmers from Tol and you're my," and before Obi-Wan can finish, have Leia interject with, "Your granddaughter, I got it." It would show that she is intelligent enough to recognize the importance in creating their cover story while still showing a small measure of naivete on her part due to her young age. It would endear us to this character and show the building blocks for her relationship with this character rather than just outright insulting that same individual for no reason in such an ungrateful and unsympathetic manner. At this point, the writers can only continue to be so unsure on how to display this character with how they have Leia constantly moving around the area and talking incessantly to a point that Obi-Wan has to keep dragging her away in order to focus on escaping the area. That she would even ask Obi-Wan why he is not even using his lightsaber, which she deduces as a sign that he is not a Jedi before then commenting that she wants him to make her float. Let's break this down. Up to this point, Leia has been established as having an intellect to such a high degree from her parents that if she were only more well behaved that she would have already secured a position as a senator at that point. At 10 years old, which is quite the impressive, if not slightly unbelievable, feat for an individual as young as her. She was then kidnapped and held in solitary confinement on an unfamiliar world by a group of alien henchmen, all without any degree of fear. All of this to be so incredibly afraid of the one individual sent by her father to rescue her that she would show no measure of gratitude if not only to end up insulting his age, constantly wandering around the surrounding area, and having absolutely not even an iota of common sense if she were to so loudly ask this individual that she is aware is being hunted by the Empire and those same henchmen that had captured her, as to the legitimacy of his being a Jedi that she would demand for him to make her float in such a public area despite not even 30 seconds prior, having her be aware of and recognize the seriousness of their plan and their attempt in escaping that planet. One might have hoped for even just a measure of decency in this company in leaving the image of this once beloved character to rest following the death of her real-life counterpart. But instead we were forced to watch this company rear its head back and ruin this character when she was only 10 years old, all within the span of 1 minute. Obi-Wan then informs Leia as to why he cannot use the Force as it would so rightly draw unnecessary attention to their location, even more to the point as they had only just very narrowly avoided a couple of stormtroopers passing by. Leia then asks Obi-Wan for his name, to which he responds with Ben, a small but interesting detail in how he would indeed require a new identity in aid of his survival as a method in making it all the more difficult to track his movements. That, along with the fact that he is able to recognize how much of a chatterbox Leia is showing to be, that he would not want to immediately inform her as of yet due to the level of danger in their midst from the constant patrol of the Stormtroopers and presence of the other bounty hunters. Leia then remarks how Ben is not even a Jedi name, which does not follow that she would be aware of any Jedi names, considering that she had just stated how she had heard that all of the Jedi were dead. If the idea was to be that she would attempt in researching the Jedi, it may have raised some level of merit if not for the very fact of how closely guarded any information of the Force users is kept by the Empire that they would prohibit any such mention of the Jedi. The previous episode in the original trilogy being clear indicators as to how anti-Jedi the Empire has established themselves to be in the regulation and control of any and all information being distributed to the systems that they oversee and maintaining their stronghold over the galaxy.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away. Regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Fear will keep the local systems in line. The Jedi are extinct. Their fire has gone out of the universe. You, my friend, are all that's left of their religion.
Obi-Wan informs Leia that she must instill her trust in him to survive, to which she rebuffs, questioning him as to why she should so openly trust him if she is aware that he is hiding something. Not only is it so obvious the fact that he is hiding his status as a Jedi that he had only just previously informed Leia as to why he must limit his use of the Force, but that she could only continue to doubt him despite the fact that he had informed her of his having been sent by her father to save her. She then comments, "You think the less you say that the less you give away, but really it's the opposite," which is quite an intuitive statement for a 10-year-old child to make. Obi-Wan acknowledges this in asking her how old she is to have formed such a thought, to which she proudly states that she is 10 years old. This line may have carried some credibility in showcasing her intelligence, if not only in having been delivered so monotonously as of having read it off of a cue card behind Obi-Wan, but for the very fact that it contradicts her character, considering not for the fact that she had only just yelled out loud his status as a Jedi to then demanding he make her float with the Force in such a public area only 30 seconds prior. Obi-Wan then comments how she does not sound as if she were 10 years old, to which she thanks him. It is quite a statement that one could most definitely agree with, considering that no one can decide how this character should be written. As Leia and Obi-Wan continue to hide and maneuver their way around the bounty hunters, the little girl with whom worked with the imposter from earlier informing him that they missed their opportunity earlier due to Obi-Wan's picture having been displayed for the chance at a reward upon his capture. He then draws his weapon and prepares to join in on the bounty as well. As Obi-Wan rounds a corner, we see that he has taken off his hood. It should not be that he is aware of the entire city looking for him, that he would only continue to alternate between keeping his hood on and taking it off. To what advantage would Obi-Wan gain in continuously removing his hood and compromising his position for his mission to fail, if only for the sake of this individual not being able to keep his identity so closely guarded to any capacity to only avoid committing that very act? If only because they were walking down a lone alley that he would decide to do this is not a reasonable excuse, as he would want to use any advantage that he would have in keeping his face hidden to only remove it once he has determined their safety off-planet. Case in point, when one of the bounty hunters finds Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan must knock him out to maintain their cover. Upon Leia's questioning, Obi-Wan informs her of the man's status as a bounty hunter. There is absolutely no excuse at this point as to why it would be that this character would ever doubt the validity and the level of danger that she is now in, that she has witnessed at first hand. The Grand Inquisitor then orders for the port to be shut down, along with a garrison of troopers to arrive at their location within the hour. All of this before warning the fifth brother to tread carefully due to Obi-Wan's abilities as one of the few remaining Jedi. He then follows this up by ordering the fifth brother to kill Obi-Wan, which contradicts what was previously stated not even 3 seconds prior, when the Grand Inquisitor had acknowledged Obi-Wan's status as a Grand Jedi Master, that he would so casually mention to the fifth brother to kill that same individual. That he would believe the same individual who growled at a Jedi escaping in his midst, rather than drawing his lightsaber or using the Force to be capable enough to defeat a Grand Jedi Master, is so absolutely ridiculous. The other Inquisitor then brings forth a bounty hunter to the Grand Inquisitor, who presents the image of Obi-Wan to him. Why would it be so important in choosing to waste time in showing a picture of Obi-Wan rather than simply outright stating what Reva had done in her effort to capture Kenobi, that she would have hired such a disproportionately large number of bounty hunters, if only to hear the Grand Inquisitor deliver this absolutely stellar line. To then showing Reva standing on top of a building, as if this entire scenario had been building to this one moment to be played off as a twist when we were already aware of the events. We then return to Obi-Wan and Leia as they collect their bearings for a moment. Obi-Wan then orders Leia not to mess with her droid for risk of it making any noise before she comments on its broken status, to which Obi-Wan then makes his opinion known on how he feels about that.
Good.
Why he would say something so callous to this girl when she is so despondent is mind-boggling that this character would say something so out of character. Although he does immediately regret his phrasing, to which he attempts to comfort her. She remarks how despite being broken, her droid remains strong. It's almost as if there is an attempt to create a metaphor in showcasing the parallels between Obi-Wan and the droid.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Obi-Wan informs Leia that her parents have been contacted and knowing that their daughter is safe and that she would be back to Alderaan by the time night falls. If Obi-Wan had had that method in communicating with Bail and Bria to inform them of their status, would it not have been more prudent for Obi-Wan to have shared his location with them so that they could retrieve their daughter? Or as Leia had stated earlier,
where's the army?
Considering Bail's monetary and patriarchal status as the ruling monarch of that planet while simultaneously holding a seat in the Senate, that he would be able to contact the Empire to rescue his daughter. As it is that the Inquisitors and the Empire are only looking for Obi-Wan and not Leia, Leia only having been involved due to Reva having kidnapped her. The Grand Inquisitor remarking how detrimental it has become to their plans that Reva had committed the act of kidnapping an Imperial Senator's daughter. That Leia is the innocent party in this entire scenario further lends credence to the fact that if Bail Organa, the Imperial Senator, had contacted the Empire that he is a sitting member of, that they would have immediately fought to ensure her safety if not for the idiotic reasoning that her heritage would have been revealed when absolutely no one else but him, Obi-Wan, and Yoda were aware of the fact. Even worse is the fact that the Empire would have now been made aware of Bail's connection to Obi-Wan due to the quite idiotic reasoning that the third sister had confirmed the status of Bail and Obi-Wan's connection, that the Empire would have every justification for killing Bail for consorting with the Jedi. Let alone the notion that Bail's family being tried for treason, sentenced to death, or a strict confinement of house arrest on their planet. By the writers choosing to keep Leia's abduction a secret, and only keeping it that Bail was the one to go directly to Obi-Wan rather than the Empire that he is a part of, they have made it abundantly clear that Bail has been in contact with the fugitive of the law. That Bail would be allowed to survive after the events of this show, let alone his family being captured by the Empire, is so fundamentally broken when you realize that there is absolutely no conceivable way in which the events of the original trilogy could have ever happened after this connection had been exposed. That the Empire would have been made aware of this and chose to do nothing in order for the original trilogy to happen is so contrived to such an insane degree that it showcases that there is truly nothing left to destroy after this story is concluded if they have already destroyed their own sequel trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and all of the events in this show. Barring all of those issues aside for the moment, it is quite curious that Obi-Wan would inform Leia that he had just sent a message to her father when only 20 minutes prior, the city employee had informed Obi-Wan that any and all signals going to and from Daiyoo were blocked.
I was tracking its signals.
You're in Daiyoo now. All signals in or out are blocked.
Yet despite the fact that all of the signals were blocked, Obi-Wan was still able to do that very same thing regardless. There are only two possible ways that this could have occurred. The first option being in that Obi-Wan was lying to Leia, which would be counteractive to his plans in getting her to trust him. Or the second option in being that the writers had forgotten the one line that they themselves had written as an explanation as to why he would not have been able to immediately run to the ship that he was tracking in order to escape without Haja arriving later on to help them escape. I should only be able to hope that any reasonable individual would be able to determine which of these reasons carried the more probable outcome. A sound then alerts Obi-Wan to the mercenary from before, in which Obi-Wan then takes notice of the hologram image of himself, attempting to turn it off. Why this hologram would turn on so suddenly by itself when it had already been turned off after the skirmish is quite questionable. Leia then notices the image and she immediately reacts. Almost as if having read the script for this episode, Leia immediately surmises that Obi-Wan was the sole reason that she was ever kidnapped in the first place, that she was to be used as a form of bait in order to draw Obi-Wan out, which is quite the inference based on no measure of knowledge on Leia's part of the preceding events. It is one matter to want to write your characters to be intelligent, but to a point that they are aware of the knowledge before having obtained it is on another level of implausibility that even a resurrected Palpatine would admit is so insubstantial. She then questions Obi-Wan if her father had indeed even sent him, which would have harkened back to earlier, and that if Bail had simply given Obi-Wan a token or symbol that Leia would have recognized as belonging to her father, that this issue would have never arisen. That she would have even questioned whether Obi-Wan was the real kidnapper when he went through so many avenues and risking his life to save her, that it begs the question of just how intelligent, or stupid, the writers want both of these characters to be.
But, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I think with Leia and Obi-Wan, like she says a few times, she doesn't know much about him. He just kind of shows up and takes her. And like that's exactly what the kidnappers did too. So like she doesn't really know that she can trust him, and when she sees that he's wanted and stuff, that's a red flag. So she's a little bit, you know, like, okay, that's not good. And so she runs away from him. And then I think the turning point is when he catches her with the Force. She starts to believe, like, oh, got it. So
At this point, Leia begins to run. As if it was not already so difficult, and having witnessed so prominently a chase of such preposterous proportions that we would have rested easy knowing that such an event would never grace our screens ever again. That any measure of confidence on the part of the writers would have applied to the chase scene in passing off as a moment of tension and excitement to come off as so oceanically cringe-inducing. That the idea that 3 fully grown adults could not catch up to a 10-year-old in one of the most barbarically idiotic chase scenes to ever grace film history. That those individuals would have never reflected upon the simple idea to utilize the technology that had been established in their universe for thousands of years, with the writers ignoring that same technology that had been established 46 years ago. All of this, to bear witness, yet again, another chase scene, so proudly displayed by such a colossal wave of stupidity that it begs the question of just how charred the writers' brains were in deciding to write this dilapidated corpse of a scene. Not to the regard of 3 faceless villains that amounted to 3 toddlers in adult bodies falling over the smallest of branches, but to relegate the passing of the accursed disease of imbecility to Obi-Wan Kenobi of all individuals is so utterly erroneous of wondering just what foolish individual would ever enjoy the sheer splendor of the absolute garbage fest that was passed off for what any fan had once so dearly loved. Let's break this down yet again, shall we? That Leia would be so casually jogging while Obi-Wan walks so slowly behind in such a crowded marketplace with absolutely no semblance of urgency, all the while exposing his face amongst this city filled with bounty hunters, Inquisitors, and Stormtroopers. That is absurd. That not one single individual ever recognized Obi-Wan despite Reva having sent out a planet-wide transmission of his image. That's just absurd. That Leia was the sole reason that they were almost exposed and captured for running away for no reason. That is absurd. That Obi-Wan was standing less than a foot away from Leia, only to let her run away again. That is absurd. That Leia was able to get so far ahead of Obi-Wan again is just so absurd. That none of the civilians thought to inform the Stormtroopers or the Inquisitors of the direction in which Obi-Wan and Leia had went is just so absurd. That all of the bounty hunters mysteriously disappeared for no reason. That is absurd. That Obi-Wan went to such lengths to let Leia run away to run across and jump over to several buildings. That is absurd. That any of these bounty hunters were able to miss Obi-Wan when he was standing directly in their line of sight. That's just absurd. That the path that Leia took on the top of the buildings being the same path as the one that Reva was waiting on. That is absurd. That a bunch of loose hanging clothing was able to deflect blaster fire. That is absurd. That Reva decided to waste time free-falling rather than simply jumping down is just so absurd. That Reva ran like this. That's just absurd. That both these bounty hunters and Obi-Wan are aware that he is a Jedi, and yet he never thought to use his lightsaber. That's just absolutely absurd. That Reva would jump off of one building to land back on the original building when she could have simply force jumped over the original obstacle. That's just absurd. That Reva would do a flying backflip instead of just running and jumping. That is absurd. That Leia even entertained the notion that she would be able to make the jump. That is absurd. That Leia would be strong enough to hold onto the line with one arm. That is absurd. That Leia would be able to hold onto the line when she is holding it with a suicide grip. That's just absurd. That Leia would not use her other arm. That's just absurd. That Obi-Wan waited 10 years to use the Force when he should have never severed it in the first place. That's just absurd. That this chase scene is the reason that Obi-Wan decided to reconnect with the Force. That's just absolutely absurd. That the writers ever entertained the notion that any intelligent individual ever enjoyed the first chase scene from the previous episode to then incorporate an even worse one here. That's just absurd. That we have reached a point where we are all being forced to watch such a beloved character be reduced to the same levels of intelligence as the same henchman who ran face first into a tree branch, simply so that the showrunners could have any sort of drama without doing any of the necessary work to actually deserve it, is just so absurd. that the moment in which this character would have reconnected with the Force in one of the most laughably absurd setups in the entirety of this franchise, when he should have never been forced into such a position of having severed his connection with the Force in the first place. The entirety of this chase scene is just so absurd. Who wrote this? How did they write this? Why did they write this? Anyways, Leia can only stare at Obi-Wan in awe before commenting that he is indeed a Jedi. A statement that would have landed any impact if not for the previous 4-minute chase scene. Even more to the point that was never needed, as Obi-Wan had only ever been trying to help Leia the entire time that he had arrived on that planet. Upon their arrival at the dock, Leia and Obi-Wan hesitate upon noticing the armada of Stormtroopers and Inquisitors that had arrived in an effort to intercept Leia and Obi-Wan. How convenient that the Stormtroopers and Inquisitors would have only just arrived at the same time as Obi-Wan and Leia had upon having reached their destination. How enticing the idea that Obi-Wan could have exhibited any measure of situational awareness in navigating around the perimeter of enemies and utilizing his previous experience as a war general. At least no one will have to worry about such a circumstance of convenience presenting itself at the last possible second out of nowhere. Upon Leia's inquiry, Obi-Wan informs her of how the Inquisitors had once been former Jedi that had been turned to such a point that they would hunt their former kind. How compelling the notion that these former children whom Obi-Wan had witnessed their training as children would have been led to a point of submissiveness in accepting their new roles as pawns of the Empire, carrying any potentiality in developing the mindset of this character in his views towards his skill towards the annihilation of the Jedi Order. But instead we were presented with another chase scene. One of the previous bounty hunters is about to attack Obi-Wan before being taken down by Haja. What is curious here is how there are several stormtroopers facing their direction, yet none of them would have noticed the sudden burst of sparks and light only 20 feet away from their current position. Even more curious is the number of civilians standing only 10 feet away from Obi-Wan's position, yet they never noticed it either. In a rare moment of Obi-Wan's character re-emerging, he begs Haja to take him but to let Leia go. Haja then gives Obi-Wan the coordinates to a cargo port in which they may escape, due to the city's lockdown, before granting them an access key. Obi-Wan is rightly skeptical of this, to which Haja affirms in how far low he had sunk in the past, but that he would at least attempt in making amends to the point that he would be willing to sacrifice his life. Why we couldn't have seen any development for his character and how he could have so suddenly come to the decision to help Obi-Wan when earlier he was so ready, willing, and able to take the bounty for himself. The only thing that he is aware of in regards to Obi-Wan is that he was the individual responsible for destroying his primary source of income, and that there was a bounty placed on his head by the Empire.
So in episode 2, you get a lightsaber. By the way, did you know you were going to have a lightsaber? Was that part of the explanation, the pitch when they
I don't think
you?
it landed until they handed it to me, and it's this double-ended, heavy, spinning, badass thing. I mean...
The coolest thing about the Grand Inquisitor, I think, is probably that double-bladed, spinning lightsaber that we've seen animated. What is it like to have that in the live-action sense? Are you going to be flying around?
I mean, I can't tell you what I do with it because, well, you'll have to tune in and find out. But it's an incredible thing just to sort of hold and have clipped onto your armor and then presented to you by the guys who made it. And yeah, it's a wild feeling.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the double-sided lightsaber. You're with two guys who are responsible for some of the best lightsaber duels in all of Star Wars and those prequels. Did you get to experience the choreography, the effort that goes into that, and kind of put your stamp on a moment like that, did you feel?
Yeah, I mean, just holding the thing is an incredible moment because you do feel a sort of, I mean, it sounds silly maybe, but sort of a power that's surging through it. And it is a very iconic weapon. And unfortunately, I can't give you any more details than that. But
at this point, the lead henchman is brought forth to the Grand Inquisitor where we see the spinning lightsaber. Let's talk about the spinning lightsaber, shall we? As if it wasn't so appallingly nonsensical, the notion that a spinning lightsaber could be used in a manner that would allow any Force user to fly. But the overall base concept of the spinning lightsaber alone is so unerringly ridiculous. If this individual is to attack his enemy's face with this spinning lightsaber, then that would simply not be possible. With the relative position of the Inquisitor's hand on his lightsaber, being that the Inquisitor is holding his lightsaber out in front of him with the position of the blades based on the function of a projective line and how the blades could extend out from the middle in order to rotate fully at 360 degrees. By that point, the only part of the henchman that would touch the blades is his nose unless the troopers continue to push his face forward into the blades. However, at that point, they would only be wasting time on intimidating this individual when they could have simply accomplished the exact same thing by killing him with one blade. With the relative position of the blades in their rotation, the henchman would not be able to be dragged fully into the blade because of the Inquisitor's arm being in the way. If the solution to that would have been to have had the Inquisitor angle his blade down as it was spinning, then that would have only ended with having the Inquisitor losing his own legs in the process. Visuals are perfectly acceptable without lending credence to the idea that the mechanics of your world building are not being destroyed at the same time. This is even more titanically idiotic when you realize the dilemma that Reva had set for herself for the fact that the Grand Inquisitor had ended up killing the henchman that Reva had ordered to kidnap Leia when it was to be for the very reason of her having gone behind his back based on such a faulty lead that should have never existed. At this point, Reva can only continue to keep screaming while continuing to parkour. With Reva having finished her superhero landing, Haja emerges before introducing himself. Why he would not have immediately shot her when he had a blaster in his hand is questionable enough. But that he would not have immediately shot her when she was rounding the corner is even more confusing. That he would instead choose to slowly walk towards his enemy with whom he is aware has the ability to kill him without even attempting to attack in any shape or form whatsoever is beyond ridiculous. Even if she were to draw her lightsaber or use the Force against him, at least the opportunity to attack her could have been utilized in an attempt to create more time for Obi-Wan and Leia to escape. This is an individual that was introduced as a Jedi using the Force and offering aid to a woman and a child in escaping the planet to safety, despite him having been revealed to be an imposter by Obi-Wan when revealing that this imposter was using a system of magnets to mimic the appearance of using the Force. This not only suggests, but directly states that if this individual were aware enough of the Force to the point that he could create a system of magnets in order to imitate the appearance of the Force, that he would be partially, if not fully aware enough of the abilities of any Force user. More to the point that he had realized that not just one, but several Inquisitors were on that planet at the same time, to the extent of having been confronted by one face-to-face later on. If he is to risk posing as one of these individuals with this level of awareness as to how dangerous they are, then why would he have ever decided to even attempt to reason with one of those same individuals on the side of the very same opposition that he is so actively opposed against? That he would attempt to reason with them is so colossally stupid in and of itself, but that he would choose not to take any and every opportunity to shoot her, but instead choosing to waste time conversing with the one individual that he is aware could kill him at any given moment. Perhaps for the idea that he is trying to buy as much time as possible for Obi-Wan and Leia to make their way to the transport safely, but that he could have most assuredly ensured their success if he would have immediately shot Reva, as she was not completely aware of Haja's presence until he was only 10 feet away from her and had announced his presence. There was no greater opportunity for Haja to take, but he has only ended up ensuring his death. Reva proves this when she slams him against the wall, only to then use the Force to break apart his mind to find the necessary info that she requires. For this next portion, let us take a look at Episode 7, The Force Awakens. Upon the introduction of Kylo Ren in the first 10 minutes, we see him kill the village's leader, which in turn causes Poe to take a shot at Kylo. Kylo, sensing the danger, uses the Force to halt both the blaster bolt and Poe simultaneously without even an ounce of effort. Right away we are able to see that this individual carries such a strong affinity for the dark side. Even more so as later on, after Poe had dealt with numerous sessions of torture wherein he had not been broken, Kylo was able to so casually rip apart Poe's mind and using the Force to extract the info that he sought. This is simply continuing to display his power level in a manner that we had not seen before, as even Darth Vader had only resorted to using a torture droid on Leia instead of using the Force. That alone highlights the issue of the Inquisitors in regards to their relation and power to Darth Vader. To elaborate, in the Star Wars canon, it has been established that the Inquisitors are only given the bare minimum amount of training in regards to lightsaber combat as well as the Force. This makes it so that the rule of two, one master and one apprentice, is still allowed to be in play, as the Inquisitors are not meant to be stronger than the actual Sith. They are meant to move more in a manner akin to a pack of wolves, weak individually but a stronger force together. The idea here, however, that this lowly grunt of a Force user would be able to use an ability that not even Darth Vader himself could use is so incredibly impossible. How utterly mind-boggling the notion that if Darth Vader was indeed made aware of this ability but instead chose not to use it in ripping apart the minds of his enemies, that he would not have thought to extract the information from Leia's mind by means of this method. At that point in the story, the Empire was so completely desperate in locating the plans that they would go to such great lengths in incinerating the two civilians whom they believed to be holding the droids that they were searching for. As they were that desperate, if the idea was that Vader was aware of this ability but chose not to use it when his overall goal was to retrieve the plans, then that would simply advocate for Darth Vader making such an idiotic decision that he would be willing to risk the destruction of the Death Star simply because he was too lazy to use the Force. That this individual would use this ability to locate Obi-Wan here when you remember that she had the opportunity to use this ability on Owen in the previous episode. Had she employed this ability then barring aside the fact that Force users can sense each other, but that she would have found Obi-Wan's location, Obi-Wan would have been captured, and the OT would have never occurred. I cannot understate how it is so fundamentally imperative in redrafting your work to be so airtight in finalizing your scripts. Having arrived at the cargo port, Obi-Wan informs Leia of its status as it was not intended for human use, to which she comments that it would only aid them as no one would expect to find them there. It is not too surprising anymore that a small child is expected to be smarter than a character with decades more experience than her simply because the writers can't help themselves in promoting how the Force is female. Obi-Wan then comments that this might possibly be a setup which would indeed follow considering just how unreliable Haja would have been in regards towards his previous actions. Leia then questions if it is truly that hard to entertain the idea as to having friends, before commenting on the fact that since she had met Obi-Wan, she had been chased, shot at, had almost fallen to her death, and that they had several Inquisitors chasing them. That the show would so forcefully shove the idea of this child being so hyper-intelligent, yet fail to realize that all of those events coincided with the downright imbecilic decisions that she herself had made in running away in the first place, only to then finish her statement by saying,
"If somebody is offering us help, I think we should take it."
In a way not yet known or explained, it has been written that Leia would never trust Obi-Wan despite his having broken into a secure facility to rescue her, informed her of his identity by way of her father having sent him, and had constantly attempted to prevent her from becoming lost in a city that she had never encountered to only end up saving her life. All of that to immediately deciding to trust a random stranger that would just so conveniently happen to have the exact solution that they require, which would carry such an enormous level of risk. Despite her having never encountered that same individual with whom Obi-Wan had previously figured out immediately was scamming so many desperate individuals. And yet we are not only being led to, but expected to believe that in both instances that she was completely justified by choosing to have Obi-Wan agree with her about the cargo transport for the simple fact that she reminded Obi-Wan of Padme. That the writers would dare to have Obi-Wan try to compare this individual who has caused nothing but problems and has nearly led to both of their deaths multiple times, to the same individual who had bravely led the fight to preserve the freedom of not only her homeworld, but for the sake of security across the galaxy. That they would even attempt to do this shows just how little they care. As long as they can dredge up a little remaining bout of nostalgia to make any contrived moment carry even an iota of emotion is disgusting. At this point, Reva has entered the cargo port, to which she flourishes for no reason before igniting her lightsaber. She then calls out,
Obi-Wan.
It is simply incomprehensible that anyone could have ever found this character engaging or charming, let alone intimidating for the sake of how childish she would act in calling out the name of her enemy as a 5-year-old would in playing hide and seek. One cannot help but roll their eyes at the fact that any executives would so honestly believe that the same man who had cut down Darth Vader would ever be intimidated by any Inquisitors, let alone by such a churlish, beef-witted idiot. Obi-Wan then gives Leia the access key, telling her to take off without him should he not make it. That a former Grand Jedi Master would be so unconfident in his abilities that he would believe that he would not be able to take down this useless tofu loaf when you stop to remember how he was able to defeat the first Sith to appear in over a millennia, a cyborg that wielded 4 lightsabers, and ended up defeating the individual that was responsible for the mass genocide of the Jedi is absolutely ridiculous. This is only bolstered by the fact that Reva then chooses to say,
I can feel you.
Again, there must be some level of irony that anyone would not be able to laugh at this gormless sack of shoelaces and that she would be so confident in believing that what she was saying was intimidating. We then see Leia running to the transport. For some reason, Obi-Wan had decided not to go with her despite the fact that Reva was not only so far behind, but that they would have immediately have been able to have left if not for Obi-Wan choosing to stay back just so that the show could have Reva act like a child. That she would call out to Obi-Wan that she could feel his presence only solidifies the fact of how ridiculous it was that she and the 5th brother were not able to sense Obi-Wan from the previous episode when he was standing only 10 feet away from their position. That she would so proudly state that she could feel Obi-Wan's fear when there would have been nothing to support any reason as to why anyone would fear this individual due to how idiotic she has been shown to act. Case in point that she would attempt to pursue Obi-Wan while attempting to maintain an element of surprise being ruined by the very fact that she has her lightsaber activated. How would Reva ever expect to have the element of surprise on her side if she was not only calling out to her enemy, but also by having her lightsaber on in such a dark room? The issue here with both of those facets is the fact that in having Reva call out to Obi-Wan that she is giving him a general sense of where she is. If he is able to pinpoint where her voice is originating from, he would simply need to move to another location and it will only end up becoming an endless loop of cat and mouse. Much like her voice, having her brightly lit lightsaber in a darkened room is only going to achieve the same effect of giving away her location. If she could indeed sense Obi-Wan, then why would she take such an inordinate amount of time in hunting him down when she could have simply located him immediately and killed him, as that was always her goal? Although that would contain any semblance of consistency or intelligence, which is something that this character is not allowed to have, as she immediately follows her previous taunt by stating that Obi-Wan has nothing to fear as he is not going to die. If that were indeed the case, then why would she have her lightsaber drawn and ready to strike, only to end her initial statement of Obi-Wan not dying by stating that he would not die, only not that specific day?
Obi-Wan?
Darling, light of my life, I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
She then informs Obi-Wan that she plans on taking him to Lord Vader, which causes Obi-Wan to hesitate, a moment that Reva capitalizes on by stating,
You didn't know.
only to end it by stating that he is alive, that Anakin Skywalker is alive. We have a few things to break down. Number 1. The reason that Obi-Wan had gone to Tatooine was because he was well aware of Anakin's past from his childhood comprised of being a slave. That the very place that he had hated due to his upbringing was the same place in which he had failed to save his mother and had brutally enacted his revenge on the Duscan Raiders that had been responsible for her death. The very same planet that he knew that Darth Vader would never feel any desire to set foot on due to all of the pain that that planet had only ever caused for him, thus making it the perfect place for Obi-Wan to hide, as it would have been tantamount to Luke's survival, as the Empire and Vader would have spent so long in attempting to find Obi-Wan without the regard of having hidden from them in such plain sight. The reason that he had ever chosen Tatooine as that planet to ensure both his and Luke's survival was because he knew that Anakin, Darth Vader, was alive. The second point to address is the matter of the namesake for Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader. They are both separate from the other, while simultaneously one and the same. It is due to Anakin's having accepted the moniker of Darth Vader that Anakin Skywalker had died and Darth Vader was born. The method of separation in that the overall figure of Darth Vader is Anakin's new identity, despite Anakin being buried so deep down that it was what allowed for him to end up saving Luke in the end and killing the Emperor. There is no possible story where Obi-Wan would not have been aware of the fact of Anakin's identity when he himself had witnessed it in Revenge of the Sith. The third point being in that he would somehow not be aware of Darth Vader's status amidst the Empire. It is more in line with the previous point, but to continue the idea that Obi-Wan would not have been made aware of Darth Vader's status, as the Empire had been in a position of power for 10 years at this point, that he would have never been made aware of a figure with an image so public as Darth Vader's for over a decade is simply nonsensical. If the idea were to be presented that it was due to Tatooine's status as an Outer Rim planet that Obi-Wan would not have been made aware of this, one must remember that Anakin Skywalker was well aware of the Jedi when he was a child. Perhaps this could be countered for the fact that there were thousands of Jedi at the time, but one must remember that the civilians of Tatooine in this specific era are still aware of the Jedi, as they were able to recognize that the Inquisitors were the very individuals who hunt down those very same Jedi. At this point, Vader is the face of the Empire. That he would not be so well known to the citizens of this galaxy is ludicrous. Even more ludicrous in the idea that the third sister would so genuinely believe herself to be the one to deliver Obi-Wan Kenobi to Darth Vader when we have seen time and time again just how incompetent and useless she has been. Not only in the regard to her own faction within the Inquisitors, but as a member of the Empire at all. The Grand Inquisitor then arrives and berates the third sister, despite her protests that Obi-Wan is finally within their grasp, only for him to counter that they cannot risk losing him again. The Grand Inquisitor has just been informed that Obi-Wan Kenobi is finally within their grasp, let alone the very fact that he is standing less than 6 feet away from Reva's current position, and would rather lambaste her for finally fulfilling her mission rather than pooling the resources in order to finally take down Kenobi once and for all. This is absolutely infuriating. That the Grand Inquisitor would have, while not as strong as a fully trained Force-sensitive individual, a significantly larger grasp over the Force than the Inquisitors beneath him, yet he would choose not to use the Force to locate their target that they have been searching for years when he is in the exact same room that they are in is absolutely insane. The Grand Inquisitor then orders Reva to move aside and that she must, and I quote, watch and learn. This is no longer a matter that can be contested as to whether any measure of intimidation could ever be factored in anymore when the only remaining conflict in this episode is shied away from hunting down Obi-Wan to full-on devolving into two 5-year-olds fighting over who gets to be the winner. That such a level of pettiness could have only ever arose over who would have the honor of capturing Kenobi when he was only 6 feet away to then having them fighting over that is simply nonsensical. At this point, Reva then stabs the Grand I repeat, this individual with the brain capacity of a rusty table lamp was able to stab the Grand Inquisitor. I cannot begin to emphasize the sheer senselessness of what was just displayed. There is simply no measure of rationality in describing just how utterly pathetic the notion that someone as pathetic as Reva would have ever contained the subtlety, let alone the ability, to catch anyone off guard that she would have ever carried the possibility in taking down the Grand Inquisitor. As to why, her reasoning simply amounts to,
Really think I'd let you take all the credit?
only to then have her so proudly stand over his corpse and so smugly ask him the position of who was now in the gutter. A callback to his insult from earlier that only ended up being used in such a jarring moment if nothing else for the fact of the showrunners having no explanation as to why Obi-Wan having been able to escape other than to have the villains literally kill each other for the sake of them both acting in a manner indicative of a whiny 5-year-old in a supermarket. If nothing else for the fact of the showrunners having absolutely no explanation as to why Obi-Wan had been able to escape. This would beg the question of why the writers had killed off this character if he was set to appear 5 years later in this universe coinciding with the events of Star Wars Rebels, but would only end up causing one to realize that this was only included just for the sake of any measure of shock value. That a former Jedi Temple Guard who had an extensive array of knowledge on multiple forms of lightsaber combat, coupled with a deep connection to the Force and years of combat experience, all of this to be overtaken completely by surprise by a completely juvenile, empty, useless character. The shot of Reva standing proudly over the corpse of the Grand Inquisitor being as indicative of how low the story must go for Disney to obliterate any sense of what remaining bout of quality remained. All of this in a conceited effort to prop up their new characters that only ever amounted to useless plastic caricatures indicative of the very same toys that they sell that nobody with even an iota of common sense would ever buy. As Obi-Wan makes it to the ship and escapes with Leia, Reva then runs out as the ship is leaving, screaming out incessantly how Obi-Wan cannot escape as he does just that. All that anyone can do is wish for this character to stop talking for how much of a migraine-inducing barnacle that she has become. But not even the writers can help themselves as they have Reva scream out one last time that she would destroy Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan can only then sit and stare off in the distance, horrified at the prospect of the information that he had been given. That Reva of all people was to inform him of the fact not being contrived enough, but that he would have never been aware of his identity or survival when he had witnessed firsthand the footage that confirmed his identity as Darth Vader. Along with having lived in a galaxy ruled by the Empire for the last 10 years without having heard of Darth Vader is insane. All of this in an effort in having Obi-Wan realizing that Anakin was alive the entire time. And of course, because we all know that they couldn't help themselves, end the episode by cutting to a shot of Darth Vader in his bacta tank. And we all know how Disney's consumers would have reacted.
Oh my gosh!
You got him! You gave him to us! Yes!
Did he like sense that?
Oh my god.
Oh my gosh.
Don't tell!
Dude, all the hair on my neck.
I know, my arm, look at that.
Stood up.
Oh god, I'm sobbing!
Oh my god!
Oh! Oh wow, what an ending!
That all it takes anymore is a wide-angle shot that lasted 15 seconds for any consumer to immediately explode rather than any measure of build-up. And we still have 4 more episodes to go.